Hey guys, alright, as you can tell, we are changing things up here. YouTube's killing this channel. I am not getting the views that I am used to, especially on certain videos that should be easily reaching a certain view count within a day, but aren't even getting that in 3 days. So, I don't know what's going on. I did some research, so I decided to look into other reaction channels. And I guess more people put their faces in a corner instead of doing what my style was. So we'll see if this works better. If it doesn't change anything, if it doesn't get my views up, then I'll just go back to the old style because I prefer that look more than the look of... Because like if you want to watch the video, you can go to the original video. You don't... Like my facial reaction should be the most important part, but I guess YouTube doesn't push that out as much, it seems. But whatever. I don't know. I'm confused. It doesn't make sense to me. But we're going to continue with the Danelaw, the fall of Eric Bloodaxe, extra history number 2. I have no clue who the fuck Eric Bloodaxe is. And I did some reading, like the reading on the description. Are we already done with Alfred the Great? I mean, I guess the series is on the Danelaw and not on Alfred, but the sources for the Danelaw isn't as solid as for the sources on the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, certainly the sources representing the Danelaw are better than sources of Viking Age Scandinavia, but, you know, it's not the Vikings didn't really care about writing things down. So we'll see how this video goes. As I've said, I am an Anglo-Saxon historian. I am not a Viking historian. So
North of York in the year 954, a line of
nearly
men
100
follow
years
the
later?
old Roman road through Stainmore Gap. It's a lonely place surrounded by hills. Eric Bloodaxe leads the pack. Days ago, he was king of Northumbria. Years ago, he was king of Norway. Now, he's a 3-time exile, forced from power by his enemies. He's headed for Dublin to plot his next move. That's when it happens. One of the men escorting him draws a sword. We don't know if it was an assassination or an ambush. It's unknown if he fought. But minutes later, the last Viking king of the Danelaw is lying dead on the desolate moor. This series is brought to you by a Total War saga, Thrones of Britannia, a new strategy game set during this time period. Let's go back 7 years. The Council of Northumbria was debating how to find a new king. Over the past decade, they'd had several, but none really worked out. All of them had been Scandinavians from the Kingdom of Dublin, and the Vikings in that occupied kingdom tended to be too pagan and wild for the Council's liking. Nothing like the settled Danes that lived there in York. The Archbishop, a power broker who had pulled the strings behind Northumbrian politics for years, proposed a compromise candidate, Eric Bloodaxe. Sure, he had spent his formative years killing his brothers for the throne of Norway, and then killing more of his brothers to keep it. Sure, he was known for being cruel. And, okay, he had fled to Britain after one of his brothers, the one he didn't manage to kill, dethroned him. But he was noble and available, and it was far better than the alternative. If they didn't get a king soon, they all knew who would be ruling Northumbria, and they didn't really want that. And so, this archbishop and his Anglo-Saxon council invited a pagan to be their sovereign lord. Wait, I hear you saying. What is happening here? Last episode, the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes were bitter enemies. Vikings were looting monasteries and...
This is the issue with them jumping 80 years into the future. They have to go back and explain it anyways. Why didn't you just... I don't understand why you had to jump this far ahead. You could have continued forth with explaining, like, maybe not necessarily Alfred the Great, but you could have gone on to his son Edward the Elder and talk about the relations that occurred during Edward's reign, and you keep going, and eventually you would still get to Eric Bloodaxe and Northumbria. But yeah, this is a bit confusing.
And now an archbishop is
The way
allying
they're
with
trying
one?
to convey
What
the information.
happened? Well, shush, I'll tell you. 80 years happened. 80 years of Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavian settlers living side by side.
It's the Scandinavians, or well, more specifically the Danes. Well, I guess by this point, more Norse and the more Norse Norwegians were also coming over more than Danes at this point too. More of a mix of the Scandinavian countries were coming over by this time, but the Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxons are of Germanic descent. They are similar culture groups. They would naturally get along more realistically than, let's say, I guess, the Welsh and the Scandinavians, right? So yeah, of course they're gonna get along. It's not like they had their differences are in religion, not so much in culture. I mean, there's some slight cultural differences, but it's mainly religion that separates the Scandinavians from the Anglo-Saxons.
Side, each learning about and changing the other. Generations of Scandinavians put their marks and their names on the landscape of what would be England. So today we are going to examine how this happened, or at least we will paint the best picture of it we can from the fragmentary written records, archaeological finds, and etymological evidence.
Or you could have just done it on the Anglo-Saxon side where you have complete records still. I mean, they're not perfect, but it's better than what is available for the Danelaw.
Keep in mind, historians are still debating major parts of this story. We have picked the theories that make the most sense to us, but reasonable people could argue that, like, everything in this episode is wrong, so, you know. Let's go further back, to 875, when Guthrum and Alfred were still—
Why are you jumping back and forth so much in this series? I feel like I'm being super hypercritical just because this is what I study.
still throwing down. As Guthrum was sneaking into Wessex, the great heathen army's other king, Halfdan, was headed north to manage the Viking-held city of York. When he arrived there, he broke up the Northumbrian estates, handing out farms and villages to men who served him. With the local rulers all displaced—
That is an Anglo-Saxon cultural thing. That is in the relationship between king and vassal. So what would happen in the Anglo-Saxons, what they would do, or what was typical culture for the Anglo-Saxons and thus, the Danes as well, is that they would reward loyal vassals or loyal servants, loyal warriors, whatever you want to call them, thanes, whatnot. They would be rewarded with land from their king. Now, originally, I guess, 8th century, so pre-700s, that land was essentially that lord would run that estate for their life, and then when they died, their son does not necessarily inherit the land. They inherit, I guess, the right to rule that land, but only if the king feels like they are a loyal servant, right? Then that changes with the introduction of bookland, and bookland is essentially tenured land, where there's a contract, and it's like, oh, you signed this contract, this land belongs to me forever, unless, of course, I break certain aspects of the contract here, right? Like, a vassal was expected to perform certain duties, and if they failed to meet those duties, they could have their bookland just torn to shreds, and they're kicked off the land, that sort of thing. So yeah, Halfdan is using something that is shared between Anglo-Saxons and the Danes in terms of their culture, because you can get evidence of that relationship between king and vassal in Beowulf.
Placed or killed, the Vikings settled in as the kingdom's new elite. This Viking kingdom of Northumbria, however, was just the northernmost point of the Danelaw. When the Great Army had first arrived in Britain, there were 4 major kingdoms: East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. By the time Alfred and Guthrum signed their treaty, the Vikings held East Anglia, Northumbria, and most of eastern Mercia.
Correct.
But the Danelaw wasn't a country. It wasn't even a centralized kingdom like Alfred's Wessex. In fact, it wasn't even called the Danelaw until after it already disappeared.
Yeah.
The Danelaw was a geographic area where Scandinavians
They are
ruled
right in
and
this
their
respect,
laws
yes.
held sway, but that's really it. Northumbria and East Anglia operated as independent kingdoms, just like they had before the conquest. But eastern Mercia, called the Five Boroughs, was simply a collection of powerful towns, all vying for their own interests. What makes it even weirder, though, is that while a Scandinavian elite did control the Danelaw, it appears that many of their kingdoms depended on the cooperation of Anglo-Saxon earls, and, even stranger, the church.
Well, yes, because they're the ones that rule the land. Of course the ruler's gonna be dependent upon the people that rule the land if he didn't kill them.
Now, you might reasonably ask, weren't Vikings infamously hostile to Christianity? Didn't they, sack monasteries and kill priests? Well, yeah, they did, all the time. But it appears that their motivation for doing so was mostly economic. The Vikings didn't hate churches, those churches were just easy pickings.
Yes.
They were like banks, except guarded by nerds in robes. And it's not like church sacking was an activity unique to Vikings. Anglo-Saxon kings, too, had been known to seize church land.
He's right. He's right. Alfred did it a lot. He even got a lot of backlash for it, but he was able to justify his reasons and thus keep the church and his vassals quiet about him taking away church land and putting it under jurisdiction of the crown to fund things and whatnot.
And sack shrines when budgets got tight. Besides, those churches were all geographically fixed. Just because Vikings were running the place now didn't mean that all those church figures could relocate or abandon their parishes and cathedrals. So the churches
technically they could. They could just flee and not come back. But yeah.
Remained in Viking territory. And to the church's surprise, the Danes generally seemed to leave them alone. And even more surprising, they proved relatively easy to convert. The earliest converts were probably tempted by political or economic boosts. Some were likely Scandinavian lords who found that their subjects liked them better if they were Christian. Others were probably Viking merchants who found that they could get better trade deals if they had a cross around their necks. And while these conversions might not have been total, historically, polytheists have a tendency to simply add new gods to their existing list rather than embracing monotheism.
Yeah.
Archaeological evidence suggests that Scandinavian settlers accepted Christianity pretty quickly. Within just a few decades, they were burying their dead in churchyards. And within a generation, grave goods started phasing out of use, replaced by stone tomb monuments combining pagan and Christian imagery. But it wasn't just the newly settled Vikings that were changing. The Anglo-Saxons were changing too, adopting Scandinavian art, clothing, even hairstyles as the groups interacted and intermarried. But the biggest impact of this intermingling was linguistic. In fact, the only way we can estimate the size and development of the Danelaw is through place names. Today, many towns around York still carry Scandinavian words paired with the Old English word tun, which means town. Some are even personal names. Stacker's Town became modern Saxton. Greamer's Town became Grimston. In fact, it's possible these names, which we still use today, are the names of the Viking captains who benefited from Halfdan's land division. Later settlers from Scandinavia who had missed the period of conquest instead tended to name land after notable features. Modern Skusby descended from the Old Norse word for forest, plus the Old English by, meaning farm. Mickleby essentially means great farm, while Skidby, hilariously, means dung farm.
Oh no!
And it wasn't just place names. Anglo-Saxons adopted Old Norse words like it was going out of style, and we still use those today all of the time, like they, slaughter, kid, strike, keel, mire. All Norse words. By the way, some of you might have noticed I tried to use as many of those words as I could think of last episode. So, okay, let's work our way back to Eric Bloodaxe. After Alfred finished dealing with Guthrum, he transformed Wessex into a military superpower, littering his territory with forts and organizing both a navy and a large conscript army. And when he
his greatest achievement, his two greatest achievements, and you just brush over them like that? Boy, his Borough System and his reorganization of the Anglo-Saxon Fyrd is extra history. Why are you focusing on the Danelaw? There's so much more content with the Anglo-Saxons. I feel I'm gonna say it. This is probably just me getting a little hostile because this is what I study. And I was hoping this would be more about Alfred and not on the Vikings. So I apologize in advance. But I feel like the reason that they are focusing on the Danelaw and the Viking side of things is because there are less sources there. Therefore, they are allowed to be they have a lot more freedom in what they say. They can be they can also be a little there's a lot less sources to go through, therefore it's a lot less reading and research to do to make sure you get their facts right. So to me, this is just feeling very meh, the series, because it's not on Alfred. It's not on the Anglo-Saxons, the people that we have plenty of sources on. Plenty of information, plenty of historiography, plenty of stuff. And they're focusing on the Vikings, in which they did not write things down. They left little behind. Why are you focusing on them? That to me does not make you more credible as a historical source if you're just going to talk about people that we don't have much information on. Therefore, you just have to go about and theorize on what we know. Especially in 10 minutes. You don't have enough time to properly assess the historical information that we do have and then present your theory. There's not enough time. That's something that happens in like a bachelor's or doctoral thesis. Not something that can be done in a 10-minute video. I did say I'm sorry in advance. Now, back to the boroughs and the Fyrd system, the levy system. Because most people will understand the term levy instead of Fyrd. The borough system was it was essentially something that was set up in Mercia first, but Alfred would use it to greater effect. It was essentially, there'd be, I think there was like 33, I think the number's 33 boroughs throughout Wessex that are essentially just fortified towns. Now, these would not work on their own in preventing a Viking invasion, as seen in Mercia, right? There needs to be a symbiotic relationship, and so Alfred, after 878, when he returns to the kingdom, and he's back again as king, and he's kicked out Guthrum, he starts the reformation of the levy system. And what he does is essentially he creates the first standing army since Rome fell. I don't think the Carolingian kings really had much of a standing army. But then again, I don't study the Carolingian kings, so correct me if I'm wrong. But from my understanding, it seems that Alfred really kind of created the first standing army since the fall of Western Rome, with this system. And what he did is essentially conscription. Half of the capable male population would serve in the army, the national army. They would be geared up and they'd be ready to move throughout the kingdom when necessary. The other half would be off duty. They would be at the farms, staying at their farms, but while they were also not being conscripted for the levy service for half of the year, they would also be required to do their duty as working in their local borough's garrison. And they would spend some time doing that so it would be 6 months out of the year, half of the population would be on duty, the other half would be at home. And then they switch after 6 months, and the people that were off duty now are on duty, and those that are on duty are back home taking care of their families, doing whatever, doing the garrison work. It was a really ingenious thing, especially for the situation inside of England at the time. And the reason it was so effective, not one of these things cannot work without the other, right? If he had just reformed his levy system, he probably would have fallen to the Vikings. Had he not reformed the borough, if he had just done the Borough System and did not reform the levies, he probably would have fallen to the Vikings. He needed both of those to work together to maximize effectiveness. So yeah, there's that rant. Now back to the fall of Eric Bloodaxe.
Died, the next generation, his son Edward and daughter Ethelfled, used that power to bring East Anglia and the 5 boroughs under the banner of Wessex, gobbling up the southern Danelaw.
Correction, Ethelfled was Queen of Mercia, and she was a bit tough, honestly. I mean, they definitely were still technically beneath Mercia, beneath Wessex, but Mercia was still relatively independent, especially under Ethelfled. I would say they were probably more independent under Ethelfled than they were under Ethelred, who was, I believe, Ethelfled's husband, and then he died, and then Ethelfled became queen because the daughter that they had was too young. And then when Ethelfled eventually dies, their daughter becomes Queen of Mercia, but then Edward conquers his cousin, his niece, conquers his niece, and truly annexes Mercia into the Wessex kingdom.
Alfred's grandson, Ethelstan, went on to capture York in 927, making him, if only briefly, the first king of England. But once he died, Northumbria again slipped from Wessex's grip.
Yeah.
Which brings us right back to the beginning. The Great Council of Northumbria
this video
making
just
a devil's
so,
bargain.
like, they didn't
it
really
seems strange, but given the politics of the time, it's not surprising.
This video in particular feels very messy. It feels they did not really coordinate well. Or the writers weren't sure what to do with this video because it's jumping all over the place. We're going from 754 or whatever we're going from 954 to 870 something or whatever years they're using, and then we're going to 921. Like, we're jumping with a bunch of characters, and they're not really explaining all those characters in the depth that they need to. They needed to stick with either Eric Bloodaxe or, as I said before, they needed to not jump 80 years in the future after their first video, but instead use episode 2 here to explain more, to explain like Edward's reign, the relationship with the Danelaw there, that sort of thing. I think would have been a lot better for conveying this information because also they're trying to explain this to a crowd that not necessarily knows about Viking Age time period. So this is something that they needed to take the time. If I were coming to this video not knowing what I know, I would be immensely confused. I would not know what the hell is going on because of the way that they are conveying this information. Perhaps I'm being way too tough on them because, again, this is stuff I study. So maybe I'm just being very critical on them. But this video is a miss. Their first video was good. This one is a big miss. This one's a big miss.
Surprising that Anglo-Scandinavians in the Danelaw seem to have preferred independence under a foreign king to domination by Alfred's heirs. So they offered Eric the job. Except it did not go so great. Eric was king for a year before Wessex marched into Northumbria and raised the shrine of its patron saint, forcing him to abdicate and make a run for it. 4 years later, he was back, ready to retake his crown. And he did for, 2 years, and then he lost it again. So Eric was once more an exile, traveling along the old Roman road. You might ask, why was he ousted the second time? Well, we don't exactly know, but we do have one clue. A 13th century book, quoting some earlier long-lost source, which alleges that the man who arranged Eric's murder was an Anglo-Saxon earl who ruled north of York. a man who, after Eric's death, would rule Northumbria as a puppet of Wessex. With his ascension, both Viking rule and Northumbrian independence met their end. England was at last united, but its culture, language, and lands would remain forever marked by the Viking presence. But that's not quite the end of Eric Bloodaxe's story. We have one more record of him, a Skaldic Death Ode, probably commissioned by his widow or his sons back in Norway. In it, Odin awakes from a dream, knowing that someone is coming, fresh from the battlefield. He orders Valkyries to bring wine and readies his hall for feasting. Valhalla trembles with the visitor's approach. It is Eric the Prince, he tells the gods. In many a land he has reddened the blade and carried a bloody sword. Indeed, Odin had only denied Eric victory because he was in great need of warriors. Ragnarok may arrive at any moment. The Grey Wolf ever gazes on the home of the gods. The visitor enters, and the heroes of old bid welcome to Eric Bloodaxe, last king of the Danelaw.
Okay, that's we're gonna... I like Odin, so we're gonna... No. Where's Odin? Odin and Fenris. Fenrir. Yeah, as I said, this video is a miss. I'm sorry. Extra Credits usually does a fantastic job with their videos, but this one is a big miss for me. And again, as I said, it's not a diss on them. I'm not mad at them. It's just, this is something that I study. So I'm going to be, of course, very hypercritical on the conveying of this information when it's stuff that I study, right? So, you know, I just want that out there. But still, as I said before, had I come into this not knowing what I know, I feel like I would have been left extremely confused because of the just amount of jumping around that they did between characters and time, with the characters in the timeline. So, with that established, focusing on the Viking side of things, I think, is not the way to go about this. You can understand a lot about the Danes and their culture because the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes are essentially very similar in culture. The reason that the West Saxons or the Anglo-Saxons are called the Anglo-Saxons, originally, from my reading, it seems that they were only called Anglo-Saxons as a way for the people on the continent, European continent, to differentiate them from the Saxons of Germany and the Saxons on the island of Britain. So they called them Anglo-Saxons just to differentiate them, which to me seems like something where they may not actually, despite the difference, the sea difference between the two peoples, between the two Saxon groups, that to me then seems like, despite the difference, they were still very similar in their cultural beliefs. Hell, I don't think Anglo-Saxons converted to Christianity until the 600s or 700s, I think was the timeline. I think it was more 600s. 700s a little late, but I could be wrong. But yeah, this could have been so much better. But I'm still gonna watch Extra Credits. I still think they do a fantastic job with their other sources, I think just because they made the choice to focus on the Vikings here, is I think the mistake that they made. I think if they had instead decided to focus on Anglo-Saxons themselves and not the Danelaw, I think they could have been far more successful. But yeah, that was the video for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And let me know what you think about this setup design I've got going on here. I don't have a green screen, so I can't be fancy. So I'm gonna be a little square in the bottom corner. I hope that's okay. We shall see if the views go up because of it. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next video.